Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to CHK Law. Welcome to the third online Greater China Legal History Seminar. My name is Christian Wolf. I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Law of the Chinese University of Hong Kong. Thank you all for joining today. We have a record number of registrations. Over 1,200 people have registered, which is great. It shows that there's a lot of interest in the topic and in our seminar series. We had to turn down a number of registrants, requests of people who wanted to join because there is a capacity limit. But the good news is that our speaker has agreed to that we record his talk today, which will then be made available on the Greater China Legal History Seminar Series website, where we can all watch it again. I trust it's not really necessary to introduce our speaker for today because he is very famous, well known in Hong Kong and elsewhere. We are very happy to welcome one of the most distinguished constitutional law scholars and legal theorists in Asia, Professor Albert Chen from the University of Hong Kong. Professor Chen was born and grew up in Hong Kong. He graduated from the Bachelor of Laws program at the University of Hong Kong in 1980 and obtained a postgraduate certificate in law in 1981. He then undertook postgraduate studies at Harvard University and was awarded the Master of Laws in 1982. After a short period as a solicitor, he then started his very successful academic career, first as a lecturer in law at the University of Hong Kong. He served as head of the Department of Law from 1993 to 1996. And of course, he was the Dean of the Faculty of Law of Hong Kong University from 1996 to 2002. He is currently a Cheng Chanlan Professor in Constitutional Law at the Department of Law of Hong Kong U. And as we all know, he is a very, very famous academic writer. He has published over 160 articles, 11 books, co-edited 8 books. He was a member of the Hong Kong Law Reform Commission from 2002 to 2008. He is currently serving as a member of the Committee for the Basic Law of the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region under the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress of the PRC. He's a Justice of Peace and an honorary professor at several universities, as well as a member of the editorial board of a great number of legal journals. So we are very happy to have Professor Chen with us. Welcome again. Over to you.
Oh, thank you very much, Dean Wolf, for the very detailed introduction. Are you able to hear me clearly?
Yes, everything is perfect.
Yes, and also thank you to Professor Gallagher for participating as well in this seminar. So I'm very honored to be able to speak to every one of you online today on this very timely topic of the origins of the Hong Kong Basic Law. The topic was actually suggested to me by Dean Wolf many months ago. I don't remember when, but at that time, of course, it was not intended to be an online seminar. And I think originally we fixed it in March, but now it's postponed to April, and it's even more timely because, as we know, we are now celebrating the 30th anniversary of the enactment of the Basic Law, which was passed by the National People's Congress on the 4th of April, 30 years ago, exactly. So may I now turn on this PowerPoint? Let me see whether it works well. So I hope every one of you can see clearly. I've prepared a set of PowerPoints, and this is not the usual PowerPoint documents which I use, because Dean Wolf has gave me an extremely useful suggestion, which is to include photos in the presentation. So I've inserted a large number of photos in this PowerPoint document, which I may not have time to talk in detail about, but you can look at them at your leisure after the seminar. So the purpose or the background of this seminar is, of course, the Greater China Legal History Seminar Series, founded and run by CUHK Faculty of Law. And I'm very honored to be able to be one of the speakers in this seminar series, particularly following Dean Wolf's last online seminar on the legal history of the One Belt, One Road project. The Basic Law of the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region is a very important constitutional instrument, as we all know, and all the major post-97 constitutional, political, or legal controversies in Hong Kong can be traced back to particular provisions in the Basic Law. As we all know, the anti-extradition bill movement last year has, in a sense, created a kind of crisis for one country, two systems. Some people questioning whether one country, two systems will continue to work. So it is now, I think, at the right time, particularly at this 30th anniversary of the making of the Basic Law, to revisit the original design of one country, two systems as embodied in the Basic Law. And I will also talk about the work of the Basic Law Drafting Committee. I have only been a member of the Basic Law Committee established in 1997. I was not a member of the Basic Law Drafting Committee, which was established in 1985. At that time, I've only started teaching for 1 year. So as a junior lecturer, I did write occasional comments on the legal issues arising from the drafting of the Basic Law. But I'll tell you a little bit about the members of the Basic Law Drafting Committee in this seminar. Unfortunately, quite a number of them have passed away, and I also want to use this opportunity to pay tribute to them for their significant contribution to the making of the Basic Law, which in my view is a considerable achievement. So let me briefly talk about the outline of this talk, what I'm going to talk about. So the talk will consist basically of 6 parts. I hope I'll be able to cover them briefly. First, there will be an introductory section on the origins of one country, two systems, the joint declaration, and the relationship between the joint declaration and the Basic Law, and an overview of the years during which the Basic Law was drafted. Then I'll talk about the source materials for research into the Basic Law, the making, the historical origins of the Basic Law. And thirdly, I'll talk about, as I just mentioned, the 2 main bodies in this process, the Drafting Committee and the Consultative Committee for the Basic Law. Then I'll talk about the other actors involved and the roles they played, including the British government and the colonial Hong Kong government and Hong Kong's political elite, as well as civil society and ordinary people of Hong Kong. Then I'll provide a chronology of the drafting of the Basic Law in this 5-year period. And finally, I'll briefly discuss some of the key issues which were encountered during the drafting of the Basic Law and the key provisions which attempted to resolve these issues. So may I now start with the introduction? As we all know, the policy of one country, two systems was not originally designed for Hong Kong. It was originally designed for Taiwan in the late 1970s, there was a change of policy towards Taiwan on the part of the PRC. In the past, they talked about liberation of Taiwan and even did not rule out the military intervention to achieve the unification of China. But in the late 70s, Deng Xiaoping, the paramount leader at the time, developed a new policy of peaceful reunification, which was codified in a 9-point statement by Ye Jianying, then the chairman of the NPC Standing Committee, announced in September 1981. Actually, the 9-point statement already included the basic elements of one country, two systems. And it was mainly drafted by Liao Chengzhi, who was the first director of the Hong Kong Macau office of the State Council, but he was also involved in dealing with this Taiwan issue. In 1979, Governor Medley Host visited Beijing and raised with the Chinese leaders the issue of the future of Hong Kong, because as we all know, the lease of the new territories was going to expire in 1997. Now, of course, at the time of this visit, there was no disclosure that this very sensitive issue was actually much discussed. But Deng Xiaoping did ask him to bring to Hong Kong a message that investors could put their hearts at ease. Now, according to historians, it was the British initiative in trying to press the Chinese government to decide on the question of 1997 that led to the Chinese government devising a policy for dealing with Hong Kong, and this policy was subsequently codified as a 12-point policy on Hong Kong's future. And according to various sources, by September 1982, which was the month when Mrs. Margaret Thatcher visited Beijing to discuss Hong Kong's future, by that time, this 12-point policy was already well drafted and developed. And that included, of course, having Hong Kong as a special administrative region and practicing one country, two systems. In December 1992, the new constitution of the PRC was adopted, which included Article 31 concerning the possible establishment of the special administrative regions, and they can practice different social systems from the mainland. So it seems that this is not working. This is not working now. Okay. So after nearly 2 years of strenuous negotiation, the joint declaration was initialed and published in September the 26th, 1984. And after some consultation, it was ratified and it was first signed. It was first signed in December 1984, and then subsequently ratified, and it came into force. December 1994, and you can see here the picture of the the picture of the negotiation, people at the negotiation table. This is a very important person, Mr. Percy Craddock. He was chief negotiator in the initial stage of the negotiation, and he subsequently continued to be the foreign policy advisor to Thatcher on Hong Kong matters, and so he played an important role in the Sino-British negotiation on the implementation of the joint declaration in the late 1980s. This is the signing ceremony. You can see Deng Xiaoping in the middle, and Thatcher and others. Jeffrey Howe was the foreign secretary at the time, and I still remember he's visiting Hong Kong in spring 1984 and making a public announcement that it was now unrealistic to expect that British administration of Hong Kong could continue after 1997. And so at that time, everybody knew that the negotiation is coming to the final stage. So at that time, Zhao Ziyang was the premier, and you can see here on the right-hand side of the photo. So the joint declaration is, I think, a remarkable document. We all know that it provides for a high degree of autonomy for Hong Kong as a special administrative region after 1997, the continued application of the common law, continuation of capitalism. And it is significant to note that it is expressly provided in the joint declaration that the provisions of the joint declaration will be stipulated in a basic law of the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region to be enacted by the Chinese legislature. Now, I highlighted several provisions which are of particular interest for lawyers, including the continued application of the ICCPR and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights after 1997, and also the provision that the legislature shall be constituted by elections, and the executive would be accountable to the legislature. Now, these provisions, as far as we know from various sources, were inserted into the joint declaration, in particular its Annex 1, at the suggestion of the British. In particular, this provision that the legislature should be constituted by elections and the executive should be accountable to the legislature was only agreed to as between the two governments in September 1984. So just 1 or 2 weeks before the initialing and publication of the joint declaration. The Chinese side, by an exchange of letters with the British side, agreed to these two provisions to be put into Annex 1. So I refer to Annex 1. So let's see. This is the Chinese text of the joint declaration. Both English and Chinese versions are equally authentic. This is the English version. This is a booklet which I got at the time. So it's 35 years old, and you see the color has almost faded. So here, this is the text of the joint declaration. You can see here in paragraph 2, the so-called 12-point policy. So beginning from here, sorry, paragraph 3, 1, 2, and then on the next page, 3, 4, up to 11, and then the 12th point is here. So the main text of the joint declaration only consists of 3 pages, including the 12-point policy. So this 12-point policy was actually decided upon by China even before the negotiation began. And as we all know, according to different sources, which agreed among themselves, the negotiation could be divided into 3 stages. In the first stage, the British insisted on the validity of the 3 19th century treaties, according to which Hong Kong, Ireland, and Kowloon were ceded to Britain in perpetuity. Now, in the second stage, Britain retreated from this position and said that it was willing to recognize Chinese sovereignty over the whole of Hong Kong, but it would like to negotiate an arrangement for continued British administration of Hong Kong after 1997. Now, this was rejected by the Chinese side, so the negotiation entered the third stage. And in the third stage, what happened in the third stage was that on the basis of the 12-point policy, the two sides negotiated the details of the post-97 governance of Hong Kong. And these details were put into annexes to the Joint Declaration. Particularly detailed is Annex 1. You can see here the first page for Annex 1, and here is the last page of Annex 1. So Annex 1 consisted actually of 14 sections. Each section consists of many paragraphs. It's a very detailed document. And then there's also Annex 2 about the Sino-British Joint Liaison Group for liaison and consultation on the implementation of the Joint Declaration, and Annex 3 on land leases. So the Hong Kong government has subsequently published a numbered version of the Joint Declaration, which each provision of the Joint Declaration being numbered. So this provision is number 155, this provision number 156, and so on. Now I'll explain the importance of these numbers in a minute. I would like to share with you a quotation from Craddock, whom I just showed you in the photo. Writing about the final phase of the negotiation, Craddock commented that once the British came to accept China's 12-point policy, a surprise awaited us. We had been pushing at the door of a locked room containing, as we thought, treasures of Chinese painting. Now the door was open and the room was found to be virtually empty. There were some broad prescriptions, little else. This offered us an invaluable opportunity to fill in the void with our essentials for post-97 Hong Kong. What this meant was that apart from a 12-point policy, the Chinese side actually did not have very detailed plans or arrangements for post-97 Hong Kong. So basically, the British side supplied to the Chinese side many working documents on how colonial Hong Kong was being governed. And these documents were used for the purpose of drafting the detailed provisions of Annex 1. So in the course of drafting these provisions, for example, the British explained that, well, the 2 international human rights covenants had been applied to Hong Kong by the British since 1976. So you should provide in Annex 1 that they would continue to remain in force after 97, and so this was accepted by the Chinese side. So a lot of these provisions in Annex 1 came about in this way. Now, 5 years later, in 1990, the Basic Law was enacted. Now, this is a particularly useful version of Basic Law published by the Hong Kong government because it contains cross-references to the Joint Declaration. I think this version is out of print nowadays. So I can show you a few pages on this. You see here, Article 105 of the Basic Law, and there's a cross-reference to provision 18 and 86 of the Joint Declaration. Okay, so that's why the numbered provisions of the Joint Declaration, which I showed in the previous document, are useful because they enable us to identify the relationship between the Basic Law and the Joint Declaration. So this is another page showing that, for example, Article 148 of the Basic Law is very closely related to provision 155 of the Joint Declaration. Now, what I've done with the help of my research assistant Timothy Zhu, who is acknowledged here, is to look at each article of Basic Law to see to what extent its text can be traced back to the Joint Declaration. So you can see here, Article 96 is completely copied from the Joint Declaration. Article 99 is is partly copied from Joint Declaration, as highlighted here. Okay, so we have done the same for other articles. Each article we have done this. So Article 103 is completely derived from or copied from the Joint Declaration. Okay, so we have used the Chinese text because, as you know, the authentic text of the Basic Law is the Chinese text. So on the basis of this this comparison, what I have done is to classify each of the 160 articles into one of 5 types. So type A article are articles completely or almost completely reproduced from the Joint Declaration. Type E is an article which cannot be traced back to any provision in the Joint Declaration, and then B, C, D are somewhere in between. And to do a numerical presentation of the relationship between the Joint Declaration and the Basic Law, I have used this number. So if it's a type A article, I give it 100% derived from the Joint Declaration. If it's a type D article, which is only to a small extent derived from the Joint Declaration, I give it a notional 25%. So you can see here the word example of how I'll calculate the provisions of Chapter 1 and to what extent they are derived from the Joint Declaration. And by calculating this way, we can get the following table, showing that Chapter 1, in terms of the articles, on the average, 70% of the articles are derived from the Joint Declaration. Chapter 7 on external affairs is 100% derived from the Joint Declaration. So every article is actually reproduced verbatim from the Joint Declaration. The lowest percentage is shown here on Chapter 4, the political structure. On the average, only 33% of the provisions are derived from the Joint Declaration. So overall speaking, if we exclude the 3 annexes to the basic, we just look at the 160 articles. Overall speaking, 52% of the articles are derived from the Joint Declaration. So that shows how important the Joint Declaration is for the purpose of understanding the origins of the Basic Law, which is the title of this talk. Now I come to another part of the talk, which is to provide a general overview of constitutional developments in Hong Kong in 1984 to 1991, which is around the time of the Joint Declaration and the drafting of the Basic Law. So in this period, there were 2 governors of Hong Kong. First is Sir Edward Yode. He was governor from 1982 to 1986. He was a member of the British negotiating team in the Joint Declaration negotiation, but unfortunately he died suddenly in his sleep while visiting Beijing at the end of 1986, and he was then succeeded by Sir David Wilson as governor of Hong Kong. Even before the Joint Declaration negotiation was concluded, the colonial government already initiated a process of, as it were, decolonization or democratization of Hong Kong by publishing the Green Paper on the further development of representative government in Hong Kong. Actually, the word further is not entirely appropriate because there's been no development of representative government in Hong Kong before this Green Paper. Representative government refers to a government, the authority of which is firmly rooted in Hong Kong and which is more accountable to the people of Hong Kong. So the Green Paper proposed some kind of constitutional reforms, particularly reform to the legislature. Yes, here you can see the cover of the Green Paper. So it proposed 2 modes of election to portions of legislative seats. Now, before the Green Paper, as we all know, all the members of legislative were appointed. There were official members who were government officials and also unofficial members who were citizens appointed by the governor to sit in legislative. Now, the Green Paper proposed that some of the seats in legislative will be open to election, partly by, some will be elected by the so-called functional constituencies, like chambers of commerce, trade unions, professional groups. So you see, the functional constituencies which are provided for in the Basic Law and which become a very important part of Hong Kong's political system today were first invented by the colonial government in this 1984 Green Paper. And then some other seats will be elected by electoral colleges, whose members would be members of the existing urban council, regional council, and district boards. Now, the district boards were actually established after Governor Medley Ho's visit to Beijing. So maybe at that time he already knew that British administration may not be able to continue indefinitely, and so we should start some process of constitutional reform. Of course, many other members of LegCo would continue to be appointed. So these are only portions of elected seats. And then these arrangements are confirmed in November '84 in the white paper. Now, the practice of the colonial government is that a green paper will be published for consultation. And after consultation, the policy would be finalized and it would be published in a white paper. So let's see whether this works. Okay. Now, what about the basic law? The Chinese side decided even as early as 1984, when the joint declaration was signed, that the drafting of the basic law would start immediately. So instead of waiting until a few years before the 1997 handover, the basic law would be drafted as soon as possible, even though it will only come into effect in 1997. So the drafting committee was set up, and I'll talk more about who are its members and so on in due course. And at the same time, in 1985, the first election to the Legislative Council took place in accordance with the white paper. Some members of the drafting committee were elected into LegCo, and the election took place after the drafting committee was established. So, for example, Martin Lee and Sito Hua, the two leading so-called pro-democracy members in the Basic Law Drafting Committee, were elected into LegCo in the 1985 election by functional constituencies, but that was after they became members of the drafting committee. As I said, Sir Everett Yode was succeeded by Sir David Wilson as governor of Hong Kong, and he remained as governor until 1992. And on the right-hand side of this picture, you can see Zhou Nan, who was the Chinese chief negotiator during the joint declaration negotiations in its later stage. And he subsequently became the director of the Hong Kong branch of the New China News Agency, which is the equivalent of the liaison office of the Central People's Government in Hong Kong after the handover. Now, the white paper of 1984 promised that before 1988, there will be a review of whether there will be further changes to the electoral arrangements to the Legislative Council in 1988. Because in those days, the LegCo had a term of office of 3 years. So LegCo elected in 1985, of course, only some members were elected, some others were appointed, would finish his term in 1988. So in 1987, May, the government published a green paper, another green paper, on what should be the political system and the electoral arrangements in 1988. And after consultation, the white paper was published. And the white paper said that in 1991, 10 seats in LegCo would be directly elected by what we call universal suffrage nowadays. So in those days, the term was mainly direct election rather than universal suffrage. So it's basically one person, one vote in geographical constituencies, electing 10 members into LegCo. Now, why was it 1991? Now, there's a big story behind this, which I'll tell in a minute. Because the key issue in the 1987 Green Paper was whether direct election to a portion of LegCo seats should be introduced in 1988, if at all. So that was the big issue. So in 1988, elections by electoral colleges and functional constituencies continue to be used. They were also appointed members, etc. Now, let me tell you about this story of the 10 seats in 1991. The Chinese side was very concerned after the Green and White Papers of 1984 that the British or the colonial government would create in Hong Kong a political system and force it upon the Chinese side to accept it by 1997. That is to preempt the Basic Law, which is supposed to determine the political system of Hong Kong in 1997. So the concern is that the colonial government will achieve a fait accompli by developing this so-called representative government. And then there will be no room for the Basic Law. The Basic Law would just have to endorse and to confirm this so-called representative government system. So there was much negotiation between the two sides, and in the end, something was agreed like this. So, and this explains the agreement. January 1986, Mr. Timothy Renton, Minister of State at the British Foreign Office with special responsibility for Hong Kong, visited Beijing, and after meeting with Ji Pengfei, who was the director of the Hong Kong and Macau Affairs Office of the State Council and also chairman of the Basic Law Drafting Committee, Renton announced that there was agreement with the Chinese side on the need for convergence between the evolving political system in Hong Kong and the system to be prescribed in the Basic Law. So convergence in Chinese is the key word here. The Basic Law is going to prescribe Hong Kong's political system in 1997 and beyond. And the British and colonial government now agrees that there should be convergence between the so-called representative government system, which is developing in Hong Kong in the 1980s, and what is going to be prescribed in the Basic Law. And he said, we are creating a set of railway lines that lead up to 1997. The Chinese side will be creating a set of railway lines that lead on from 1997. The need is to see that those two railway lines meet together at a crossing point. So the convergence theory explains why it was agreed between the two sides that direct election to LegCo would only be introduced in 1991, because the Chinese side said that, well, it is up to the Basic Law to decide whether any seats, if at all, in LegCo of the Hong Kong HKSAR would be directly elected by universal suffrage. The Joint Declaration only says LegCo will be constituted by elections. It doesn't say direct election by universal suffrage. So, and the British side wanted to introduce direct election in LegCo, and also there was a consultation and a survey of public opinion after the Green Paper of 1987 was published, and there was also a strong body of public opinion in favor of having at least some directly elected seats in the Legislative Council. And so the compromise was achieved, which is that, well, there would be directly elected seats in LegCo, but they will only start to be introduced in 1991. And by that time, the Basic Law would have been enacted, because there was a timetable for the amendment of the Basic Law by 1990. And the Chinese side actually indicated to the British in these confidential negotiations that the Basic Law would not rule out direct election, would allow some directly elected seats in LegCo after 1997. Therefore, it was agreed between the two sides that 10 directly elected seats could be created in LegCo in 1991. The Basic Law, or the first draft of the Basic Law, was completed and published for consultation. And as we all know, there was a great debate about its provisions, not only debate about the political system and election, but also about provisions relating to the relations between the central authorities and Hong Kong and so on. So this is the cover sheet of the draft Basic Law, the first draft of the Basic Law. After consultation, the second draft was published in February 1989. And before the consultation finished, we have the student democracy movement in Beijing erupting in spring 1999, leading to, as we all know, the Tiananmen incident of June 4th, 1999. So this was actually a very a time of turmoil in Hong Kong. We saw in these months the biggest demonstration ever in the colonial history of Hong Kong. And there are also many political activists emerging to condemn the Chinese authorities in relation to the handling of the student movement, as you can see in these photos. Actually, two members of the Basic Law Drafting Committee, namely Martin Lee and Sito Wah, were among the leaders of this movement to support the student movement in Beijing and to condemn the Chinese authorities' actions. And these two members were subsequently expelled from the Basic Law Drafting Committee at the end of 1989. And two other members of the drafting committee resigned because of June 4th, and they included Mr. Louis Cha Leung Yong, the very famous martial arts novelist and founder and director of Ming Pao newspaper, as well as the co-convener of the very powerful political subgroup of the Basic Law Drafting Committee. So he and Bishop Reverend Peter Kong resigned from the drafting committee. There was a crisis of confidence in Hong Kong after June 4th, and there were more or greater demands for speedier democratization than before. It was in this environment that the final version of Basic Law was finally adopted by the NPC in April 1990. Actually, in my opinion, there was no fundamental change of policy as between the second draft of the Basic Law and the final version of the Basic Law as enacted in April 1990. So here's a Chinese quote. Mr. Lu Ping, who was the Deputy Secretary General of the Basic Law Drafting Committee, and subsequently he became Director of the Hong Kong and Macau Office of the State Council in 1990 to 1997. He wrote in his memoirs that when the NPC voted to pass the Basic Law, he saw that this Basic Law, which was produced by a great deal of efforts, was finally passed, and he was moved to tears. And he said that, well, every word in the Basic Law is worth 1,000 pieces of gold. Here you can see the NPC voting on the Basic Law, and this vote was cast okay, I have to check whether it is actually the NPC, because I'm not sure whether NPC members would each individually vote in this way. In any way, it is a vote on Basic Law either during the final meeting of the Basic Law Drafting Committee or at the NPC, and the person casting a vote was Xu Jiatuan. He was director of the Hong Kong branch of the NCNA between 1983 and 1990, and he was also in the Basic Law Drafting Committee. So he was a very important person. According to various sources, most of the people recruited to join the Basic Law Drafting Committee, I mean the Hong Kong members of the Drafting Committee, who were going to be the Hong Kong members of the drafting committee. He was the most important person making the decision. We also know that he defected to the USA in mid-1990. And by that time, Zhou Nan has replaced him as director of the Hong Kong branch of the NCNA. Here was the NPC voting. The number of votes in favor and against. So this picture is probably not the NPC, probably voting at the Basic Law Drafting Committee. And you can see here Deng Xiaoping and Jiang Zemin, who had replaced Zhao Ziyang as General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party. This Jiang Zemin in 1990, after the Basic Law was passed. And also Deng and Jiang here. So after 1990, we have 1991, the electoral election. 18 seats were elected directly by universal suffrage. So why was it 18 and not 10? Now 10 was the number agreed upon between China and Britain at the time of the 1987 review of representative government. Now, the number 18 was actually agreed upon between the two sides in a famous exchange of 7 letters between the foreign ministers of the two governments, which took place in January and February 1990. So actually, after June 4th, the British continued to have discussion with the Chinese authorities on the future of Hong Kong's political system and how the Basic Law should be improved. And it was finally agreed as between the two sides that 18 seats of electoral would be directly elected in 1991, and it was also agreed that 20 seats will be directly elected in the first electoral of the Hong Kong SAR. So you see the electoral elections. 20 seats directly elected in the electoral elected in 1998, and then the number was increased to 24 and 30 subsequently in accordance with the provisions of the final version of the Basic Law. And then there are other seats elected by functional constituencies and electoral college or election committee. And arrangements for election of the chief executive by a grand electoral college or election committee were also provided for in the Basic Law. Now, let me briefly review the source materials for research into the Basic Law. This is the second part, and I'll have to speed up a little bit since time is running out. This is a very useful book published by Wen Po, containing factual information of many things that happened during the drafting process. Chinese title is 基本法的誕生. Another very useful book written by journalists who participated in reporting on the meetings of the Basic Law Drafting Committee and Consultative Committee, called 不變50年. This is a very useful book, very authoritative, written by Li Hao, called 回歸的歷程, The Journey of Reunification. Li Hao was the Secretary General of the Basic Law Drafting Committee. And actually, Li Hao, together with this person, Lu Ping, were, in my view, the two most important people actually in charge of the drafting of the Basic Law. Lu Ping was the Deputy Secretary General of the Basic Law Drafting Committee at the time, and this is his memoirs. This book was written by Wu Jiping, who was a young staff member of the young staff member supporting the Chinese negotiating team during the joint declaration negotiation. And he, in this book, provided a very detailed record of what happened during the negotiation, including the substantial British input to the drafting of Annex 1 to the joint declaration. This book was written by Wang Manfong. He was a member of the 5-man team established in 1983 to work on the so-called 12-point policy on the future of Hong Kong. Zhou Nan, I've already mentioned him. He also wrote memos. And then this was the memos of Chen, who was the Chinese foreign minister during the final stage of the drafting of the Basic Law. And he was the person who negotiated with the British Foreign Secretary on this arrangement for 18 directly elected seats in HKSAR in 1991. Xu Jiatuan, he was a very important person, despite his defection or escape to the US in mid-1990. During the process of drafting of Basic Law, he did play a very important role, and his memoirs here is, in my view, a very valuable source of information about what happened in those days. Percy Craddock, whom I mentioned, wrote this very useful book called Experiences of China, which revealed a lot of insider information about the Sino-British discussion, both during the negotiation of joint declaration and subsequently in the course of the drafting of the Basic Law. Geoffrey Howe was foreign minister at the time. He also wrote his memos. And then even in the memos of Margaret Thatcher, there were a few pages about the joint declaration negotiation and the discussion in, for example, 1989 and so on. This is the memos of Zhong Xiyun, Sir S.Y. Chung. He was the senior member of the Hong Kong Executive Council at the time of the Sino-British negotiation. And unlike all other people in Hong Kong, the members of the Executive Council were briefed in great detail about what was happening during the negotiation by the British government. So it is this book which reveals that this provision on LegCo being constituted by elections was not so easily negotiated, and it also reveals the thinking of the Chinese side on this particular provision. Sito Wa, who together with Martin Lee, the two leading members of the Basic Law Drafting Committee belonging to the so-called pro-democracy camp, wrote this memos called Dai Gong Dong Hui. And he revealed quite a lot about the pro-democracy movement in the 1980s. And he also continued to lead the democracy movement after the handover. So newspapers are a very important source of what happened during the drafting of the Basic Law. So some papers relating to the drafting of Basic Law were actually published in newspapers, and they also published articles. And you can look at these in great detail. So this article published in Ming Pao last week by Martin Lee, because Ming Pao published 4 articles consisting of interviews with former members of the Basic Law Drafting Committee and Consultative Committee. And one of these interviews was Martin Lee, and he actually said that there was a high degree of transparency in the drafting process of the Basic Law. And I quote these relevant passages here, which I don't have time to go into detail now. Then there are the documents of the Basic Law Drafting Committee and Consultative Committee. They are very valuable sources. They were not confidential. They were released even to members of the Basic Law Consultative Committee at the time of the drafting. They are now collected in electronic databases, both at our university library and the LegCo library. So you can actually access them electronically. And so this is an example. This is the collection of documents of the 6th plenary session of the Basic Law Drafting Committee. And they are also translated into English by the Secretariat of the Basic Law Consultative Committee. So, so I will not go into these pages which I have reproduced here. The pages which I have selected from reproduction here were intended to show 3 points. First, they showed the initial draft of some of the key provisions of the Basic Law and the comments and discussion surrounding them. Secondly, they showed that individual members of the Basic Law who were actually named in these documents were given particular tasks, such as writing particular research reports on some aspects of the drafting of the Basic Law. And thirdly, they also show the operation of the Basic Law Drafting Committee, how it operated in terms of subgroups, and the subgroups presenting reports on their work to the plenary meeting, and how the plenary meeting would be divided into 3 groups for the purpose of discussing the draft Basic Law provisions and reports of subgroups and so on. So so those of you who will be able to get these PowerPoint documents will be able to read these pages at your leisure. Now I turn to the documents of the Basic Law Consultative Committee. So this is the first draft of the Basic Law, published in 1988, together with an introduction and summary compiled by the Secretariat on the Consultative Committee of the Basic Law. So the introduction and the summary are actually very useful sources. For example, you can find in the summary that Article 158 of the Basic Law on the interpretation of Basic Law was actually inspired by the EEC, which is now the European Union practice of national courts referring provisions of the European law to the European Court of Justice for interpretation. So this is another piece of reference material compiled by the Consultative Committee, and you can read how these documents provide a record of different proposals about Hong Kong's political system and electoral system after the handover, and how they compare with relevant proposals in the Basic Law itself. Then there's a very bulky, useful source, a 3-volume book called The Overview of the Drafting Process of Basic Law, edited by Lei Houyi. So this is also a very useful document. Now, there are also documents released by the British National Archive. Since these documents relate to matters which happened more than 30 years ago, they have now been released. And I've shown here some sample documents retrieved by my colleague, Dr. Michael Ng. This is, for example, the British government's document on what they consider to be improvements to the key articles of the Basic Law in its second draft relative to its first draft. And this document is provided by the courtesy of Mr. Gary Zheng of South China Morning Post, and he retrieved from the British Archive this document, which contained very detailed comments on individual articles of the second draft of the Basic Law and proposed actions on the part of the British or Hong Kong government in raising the relevant issues with the Chinese authorities. Now, what about books written by academics? Well, there are 3 members of the Basic Law Drafting Committee who were leading professors of constitutional law in China. Unfortunately, all 3 of them have passed away, and they have written books on the Basic Law shortly after the Basic Law was enacted. So this is a book edited by Wang Shuwen, one of the main members of the drafting committee. This is a book written by Xiao Weiyun, and I reproduced a few pages of the book, which are particularly useful in understanding how the political model, how the electoral provisions in the second draft of the Basic Law were developed. Now, these are 2 books edited by Xiao Weiyun of Peking University, professor, who was also a very important member of the drafting committee. He was the co-convener of the political subgroup of the drafting committee. And if you read the drafting committee's documents, which I've just referred you to, you will find that he actually was the person in charge of drafting most of the articles in the political system chapter of the Basic Law. There was also another professor of Renmin University, Xu Chongde, and he produced this book on the Basic Law of Hong Kong and Macau. Hong Kong people, well, at that time in 1988, my colleague, Professor Peter Wesley-Smith, and myself edited a book on the Basic Law in Hong Kong's future, commenting on the first draft of the Basic Law. There was another book called Basic Law and Basic Questions, which were very useful, also published at the time. After the Basic Law was enacted into law, Dr. Ming Chen and another colleague published this book on the Hong Kong Basic Law. On the secrets of the negotiation between Britain and China, both during the Joint Declaration and in the late 1980s, in the course of the development of representative government in Hong Kong, this is a very important work written by a Chinese scholar called Gou Mongloi. And this book was actually based on his PhD thesis, which he did in Japan. And you can see here, and I gave you the web address of the PhD thesis. And then here are other books. Fall of Hong Kong, written by journalists, provided a lot of insider information. And this book, written by a senior assistant to Mr. T.S. Low, also provide a lot of inside information about the politics of the Basic Law, particularly at the highest level in Beijing. Now, T.S. Low was responsible for proposing a bicameral legislature for post-97 Hong Kong, and these provisions in the Basic Law now on the so-called separate counting or split voting mechanism could be traced back to his original proposal. I referred to Martin Lee and Cedar Wao early on. Now, they wrote this book, which I bought at the price of $3 Hong Kong, which you can see here, in 1988. And in this book, or booklet, they talk about their views on each draft article in the Basic Law and their criticisms of comments and their proposals about how the article should be improved. Yeah, these are pages from that book. Now, maybe I'll still continue for at least 10 more minutes. Now, briefly, the Basic Law Drafting Committee. Here I've mentioned some of the more well-known members of the drafting committee here. There are Hong Kong business people, like Y.K. Pao, An Zigai, Li Jiaxing, Fok Yingdong, Liao Wangfat, Cha Zaiman, and Li Guokbo, David Lee. They are very famous in Hong Kong, and they were members of the drafting committee. There are professionals like Dr. Raymond Wu Waiyong, an accountant, Sanford Yong. There were 2 former vice chancellors of Chinese U of Hong Kong and Hong Kong U respectively, Ma Lin, Chinese U of Hong Kong, former Vice Chancellor, and Raisin Huang, former Vice Chancellor of Hong Kong U. They were religious leaders, and I've already mentioned the involvement of Louis Chow, who was also who can be considered a media personality because of his ownership of Ming Pao at the time. A teacher and very famous activist, Sito Wah. Now, what about people with legal background from Hong Kong? There are 4 people with legal background from Hong Kong in the drafting committee. They were Martin Lee and Maria Tam. Both of them were barristers, and Martin Lee was Queen's Counsel. And Dorothy Liu Yuzhi, a solicitor, who was very vocal, and unfortunately she passed away shortly before the handover. Justice Simon Lee of the Hong Kong court was the judge who played an active role in the Basic Law Drafting Committee. And then only one person from the labor or so-called grassroots called, he's Tam Yu-zhong, currently the member from Hong Kong in the NPC Standing Committee. In this series of articles published in Ming Pao last week, Tam Yu-zhong talked about how the overwhelming majority of Hong Kong members in the base of the drafting committee were from the business field and also included some professionals. And he also talked about how he failed to get a provision on collective bargaining, failed to get it incorporated into the Basic Law because of the votes of the business people among the Hong Kong members of the Basic Law Drafting Committee. And here is the relevant provision passage. So here you find a list of the mainland Hong Kong members and their background. And this is a list of the chairman and the vice chairman of the Basic Law Drafting Committee and the secretary general and vice secretary general. And here are photos. Here is the list of the 5 subgroups of the drafting committee. The drafting committee worked by subgroups. So the preliminary draft of each chapter of the Basic Law was actually drafted by a subgroup, one of the 5 subgroups, and then reported to the plenary session for discussion, and then the different chapters were consolidated into one comprehensive document. And each subgroup has 2 co-conveners, one from Hong Kong and one from mainland. Here is a list. Here I include this document because at the end of this document it says who died before, who in the drafting committee died before completing the drafting, and then who resigned and who were expelled or terminated. So then there are many photos. You can read them here and also identify who are the members whom I've talked about. Most of the people whom I've talked about can be found in these photos. Here we have a list of the 9 plenary sessions of the drafting committee, when they were held and where they were held and so on. And here a list of all the meetings of the subgroups, each of the 5 subgroups of the drafting committee. So you see they held large numbers of meetings. Each member of the drafting committee can be at most a member of 2 subgroups. The drafting committee also had the responsibility to decide on the emblem and the flag of the Hong Kong SAR. Now I turn to the consultative committee. This was a committee set up in Hong Kong, organized by the Hong Kong members of the drafting committee, consisting of community leaders from 8 sectors of Hong Kong society. And there are altogether 180 members. And it was led by an executive committee and also 7 office holders. So here you have the inaugural meeting of the Basic Law Consultative Committee, and then there are other photos. So maybe there are 1 or 2 people whom I should mention to you. This is Mr. C.Y. Leung, subsequently Chief Executive, and he was in those days Secretary General of the Basic Law Consultative Committee. This was Mr. Vincent Low, who played a very important role in organizing the so-called business and professional group of 89 members in the Basic Law Consultative Committee who were very active in putting forward proposals for political or electoral models. He is the director of the Shui-On group of companies. Here, in this picture, you can find here Professor S.K. Lau Xiaogai, a leading scholar, political sociologist who wrote a lot about the Basic Law in the 1980s, and he subsequently became the head of the Central Policy Unit of the Hong Kong government under Chief Executive Donald Tsang. Xiu Xianbo, he was Deputy Secretary General of the Basic Law Consultative Committee, and he also became a head of the Central Policy Unit when C.Y. Leung was Chief Executive. Now, after the June 4th incident, the so-called conservatives in the Basic Law Consultative Committee, led by Mr. Vincent Low, and the Democrats, including people like Yang Sam here, who subsequently became a leader of the Democratic Party, and together with some moderates, led by several people, including my former colleague Michael Look, who is here. These 3 groups try to get together to put forward a unified stand, a political reform proposal, which was supported by all 3 camps, which was more liberal democratic than the original proposal of the group of 89. This is a picture of Mr. T.S. Low, which I've already mentioned to you. And here you can find a list of all the members of the Basic Law Consultative Committee and the sectors where they belong to. So now, who were the actors in the Basic Law drafting process? Well, apart from the PRC government and the 2 committees I've mentioned, the British government played a role, even though the role was not made public, because the drafting of Basic Law was a domestic affair for China. But the British did provide a lot of input during the Basic Law drafting process through the Sino-British Joint Liaison Group and other channels, and many sources, both in English and Chinese, which I have referred to just now, provide evidence of the British participation behind the scenes in providing input into the drafting of the Basic Law. Hong Kong's political elites played an important role through the Hong Kong Basic Law Consultative Committee. These were people co-opted into the committee, and the Chinese authorities did pay a lot of attention to their views, and in my assessment, they had a very significant influence on the drafting of the Basic Law. Of course, the political elite was divided among the so-called conservatives, mainly in the business and professional group, the so-called BPG of the BCLL, BLCC, and the Democrats. So we can trace the origins of this democracy movement in Hong Kong to the mid-1980s, to the days when the Green Paper of '94 was published, and to the days of the consultation on the Hong Kong draft, on the drafting of the Basic Law. It was in those days that these political camps, like the so-called conservatives and the Democrats, emerged. And many of the leaders of the subsequent political parties, like the Hong Kong Democratic Party, already emerged as activists in the mid and late 1980s during the process of the drafting of the Basic Law. And then they did, together with civil society, they did achieve some impact. You can see in the Macau Basic Law, there's no provision that eventually the chief executive or all members of the legislature would be elected by universal suffrage. So it was, in my assessment, it was because of the significant support in the community for the pro-democracy movement in the late 80s that in the end some kind of compromise was achieved. The CE and the whole election would not be elected immediately by universal suffrage in 1997, but eventually they would be elected by universal suffrage. So it was a kind of timetable and direction of development stipulated in the Basic Law. And even the so-called conservatives did not object to this. If you look at the various sources which I just mentioned, even the conservatives, the so-called group of 89 or the business and professional group, agree that by the first decade of the 21st century, the chief executive can be elected by universal suffrage, and the whole LegCo may be considered for election by universal suffrage. So they are in favor of a progressive democratization of Hong Kong. They are not opposed to democratization, even among the so-called conservatives. So here you have these Mr. Sito Wah, very important leader of the democracy movement. They engage in protests. So this is, they're not happy with the political model or the lack of sufficient democratization. So this was a protest in which the Basic Law, or part of the Basic Law, was burnt. Another protest before the then office of the Hong Kong branch of the New China News Agency. So here you can see the chronology of the drafting of the Basic Law. Okay, what I've done is to list on the left-hand column the meetings of the Basic Law Drafting Committee, briefly DC. And on the right-hand side, you can see other developments such as the development of representative government, green paper, white paper, and so on. So as you can see here, by the end of December, by September, there was a Sino-British understanding on the review of representative government and the introduction of a few directly elected seats in LegCo in 1991. And then, convergence, I've already discussed it. And then you can see that there was an agreement between the British and the Chinese side on the through train arrangement reached by the end of 1988. And then you can see here the first and second draft of the Basic Law and when they were published and the relevant meetings. There were many controversial issues which were resolved one by one during the process of the drafting of the Basic Law. And here I've listed some of them, and I don't have time to go through them. If you are interested, we can discuss it in the remaining minutes. And here a list of some of the key provisions of the Basic Law. And we can trace how each provision evolved during the drafting process and what were the issues debated during the drafting process. So may I now conclude the seminar by saying a few words. As I already said, I believe the Chinese authorities in deciding on the ultimate content of Basic Law did try to take account of the views of the Hong Kong people in the Basic Law Drafting Committee and Consultative Committee and public opinion in Hong Kong. They try to secure as far as possible, a degree of legitimacy for the Basic Law and to win public support for it. They did not have preconceived ideas about what the ultimate content of the Basic Law would be at the time they started drafting the Basic Law. So they were quite open-minded, in my view. So for the people who were drafting the Basic Law, they did not have much experience to go by. In Hong Kong, in those days, we don't have the first election, so-called indirect elections to the legislature, were only introduced in 1985. And throughout the process of drafting the Basic Law, there were no experience, no practice of direct election by universal suffrage. So these draftsmen of Basic Law actually did not know how things would work after 1997. So they were planning for a kind of brave new world, but they have no guarantee about how it will work out. They have bold visions. To some extent, we can say that they were quite idealistic or optimistic about how one country, two systems can work. For example, they believed that Article 23 would be enacted to protect national security. They believe that the chief executive and legislature would ultimately be elected by universal suffrage. And as we know today, none of these objectives have yet been achieved. So I think I can compare what is happening to a young person who used to have high hopes and ideals and ambitions, who has now reached middle age, and then he or she finds that a lot of what he or she wanted to achieve when he was young, or he or she was young, has not yet been achieved, and so he or she suffers from some kind of midlife crisis. That is what Hong Kong is experiencing now. But I think we should not give up. There's a chance to reboot. We can revisit the hopes and aspirations of Hong Kong's earlier days in the 1980s, and try to reorient ourselves, to reflect on the experience of the last 20 years, to see where is it that we may not have done good enough, and reaffirm the original spirit, or as in Chinese, the 初心, that motivated this grand design behind the Basic Law. So that's all I want to say. I'm sorry that I probably exceeded the allotted time.
Thank you very much, Professor Chen. This was a fascinating talk and very, very detailed. So a lot of work must have gone into this. And this is the end of today's Greater China Legal History Seminar. Thank you all for joining, and special thanks again to Professor Albert Chen for all the insights and for such a great storyline throughout the whole seminar. Thank you.